Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, now that we're talking about him and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin appeared in front of the Appropriations Committee begging for money for Ukraine and Israel. As you know, or maybe you don't know, but I'm about to tell you, the House is trying to split up the bill. So Biden went out saying that he wants to give about $100 billion to both wars, saying that he was going to set aside quite a bit for Ukraine, the majority of it for Ukraine, and then a bit of it for Israel, about $15 billion for Israel. The House GOP is not thrilled with this because many of them do not want to fund Ukraine anymore. There's waning support on that. And we're going to get to that a little bit later, how Zelensky is feeling extremely defeated and he just feels like he's talking to a brick wall. But Blinken and Lloyd Austin went in front of the Appropriations Committee, basically making the case as to why the United States needs to give $105 billion to Ukraine and Israel. And they say that we need to give them this money. It's a matter of must because we can't show that we're weak. They said that we've got to contain China. We've got to protect democracy. And that if we don't do this in Israel and Ukraine, that it might seep over and we end up having a real risk here in the United States that we could just lose everything that we've stood for when it comes to democracy. A lot of problems with that. First of all, Ukraine is an incredibly corrupt country. And that is something that we're going to get into. This incredible piece put out by Simon Schuster with Time did this expose where he was able to follow Zelensky. He's reporting from Kiev, was able to follow Zelensky and follow his team around and really get the inside scoop as to what's going on. And there is a boatload of corruption going on in Ukraine is what he discovered. So what kind of a democracy is it really? I mean, but then again, we got a lot of corruption in our government. So then you have to ask, how much of a democracy are we when we have so many corrupt figures? But I think in Ukraine, it's like, tenfold, like a lot more corruption going on where they're really siphoning money off of, we give them a bunch of money and a lot of the players there start siphoning off the money for their own stuff, for their own personal pleasures, vacations, expensive items and whatnot, just increasing their own personal wealth. So there's a real problem with that in Ukraine. So as we are protecting democracy, are we just trying to continue this money laundering scheme? It looks like Ukraine is looking more and more like it's a resource for money laundering. So what are we really doing there? And as far as Israel, again, you've got Netanyahu there who's been trying to consolidate his power. The man has been in power for much longer than any U.S. president could ever sit in power for. We're talking. This guy has been in since the 90s. He's been in since the 90s, so a very long time. So he's been in since Bill Clinton. So you've got Clinton and who came after Clinton. Then it was Bush and then Obama and then Trump. So, he's been around for a really long time, Netanyahu has. And on top of that, he has tried to erode Israel's democracy by eroding the Supreme Court, their ability to actually enact checks and balances, further consolidating Netanyahu's power. So it's questionable. If any other country were to have done that, they would have been criticized. If that were when it was China, when Xi was consolidating his power, when it was Putin consolidating his power or making it to where they could run indefinitely the same way Netanyahu can, that was criticized. But when Israel does it, it's still a democracy. So there's a lot of questions around what do we consider a democracy versus what a real democracy actually is or what it should be. But nonetheless, they're saying we've got to do this because we have to protect democracy. That's the reason why we wage wars. They're saying we need to do it because we need to show China and contain China. And then also, if we lose these wars, they argued, then it would show our enemies, China, aka China and Russia, we have to win, basically. We can't lose, otherwise it shows them something we don't want them to see. I don't know exactly why we need to, we're not fighting, so we're not in these wars, actually. We're just giving a bunch of money and military weapons over to these countries. So what are we showing off exactly? Are we showing off our military might? No, we're not. We're showing off how much money we're willing to. We're trying to get into a race of who could go broke fastest. I mean, that's what it looks like. And so China's like, wow, I guess they really want to go broke. I guess that's what they're, angling to do. It's just a very bizarre place to be to say we have to do this in order to show our enemies. What are you trying to show them? That's a question that I wish somebody on those committees would actually ask these guys, rather than just gobbling up these lines that people are just kind of programmed to say without thinking. One of those being, we need to show our enemies otherwise. Okay, what are you showing them, though? What is exactly you're trying to convey by spending $105 billion? They also talked about how that if we don't give them all this money, and if they don't win, then we're going to be playing whack-a-mole. They say, because these our enemies are going to grow stronger and they're going to potentially expand, and we're going to have a harder time defeating them in the future. So we have to do it now, because if we don't do it now, later is going to be too late. Is kind of what they were arguing on this. Some of the GOP senators, interestingly, are interested in cutting funding to the IRS. They don't like that money that's going to the IRS to hire the 83,000 extra agents. And so they're saying, why don't we cut from that? And you can have some of your money for your war if you cut from the IRS. But the Biden administration doesn't want to go for that. So there's, some interesting things at play. We're going to see how, if they end up giving that $105 billion, right now, the House Republicans have been able to pretty much separate the bills. So $14.3 billion is supposed to be going through and voted on for just Israel funding. But this is still up in the air, and there's still a lot of angling going on. And so there's a possibility that these do get lumped together, that these packages get lumped together. And we do see an enormous aid package being voted on for Ukraine and for Israel, while the United States suffers, and we've got all kinds of problems in our own country, but we're just going to go ahead and fund endless war. And the big question is, what are these wars trying to accomplish themselves? Because, let me just save that. And we'll get into, how do you win these wars? What classifies as winning these wars? That's a big question to ask. We have been engaged in endless wars in the Middle East without any real. At what point do we know we've won? How do you win a war on terror? Those are big questions. But first, let me just show you this video. I watched the entire Blinken and Lloyd Austin, the testimony in front of the Appropriations Committee. This is one of the things that happened. This actually happened throughout their testimony. This same sort of thing kept happening over and over and over again. But look at this. This is Medea Benjamin with CodePink rising up, confronting him during his Appropriations Committee hearing and yelling at the back of the room that we want a ceasefire. Watch this.
Not shrinking back. Not in the face of Russia's aggression against Ukraine. Not in the face of an intensifying strategic competition in the Indo-Pacific and around the world.
If the witness will suspend, and I ask that everyone again respect this hearing, we will suspend until the room is cleared.
Is calling for a ceasefire. Shame on you all. The world is calling for a ceasefire. The American people don't want to support this brutal war. Stop the war. Stop the ceasefire now. Stop funding this brutal massacre that Israel is doing on the people of Gaza. Ceasefire now! Ceasefire now! Ceasefire now!
Thank you, Senator Blinken, if you can continue.
Good for her. That ended up happening several times, not with just her, but others. You could see all those people raising their hands. They have representing the blood on the hands, the red hands. Many more people continued to do this throughout his testimony. At the end of the testimony, it kind of required Antony Blinken to address this because it had happened over and over throughout his hearing. And so he said, I've heard you. We are trying to limit and mitigate civilian casualties. That is on all of our minds. We're really, truly trying to do this while at the same time trying to reach our goals, essentially, which is what exactly? And that is the big question. What are the goals? Let's go into this great piece that was done by Simon Schuster in Kiev for Time, following Zelensky around, looking into his operations and into his presidency and his advisors. And really just this piece showcased a defeated Zelensky. Look at the title of it even. Nobody believes in our victory like I do. Inside Volodymyr Zelensky struggled to keep Ukraine in the fight. Let me read some excerpts to you because this is just this is where we're at with this war. And I think that this is how many people, the big question is, why did we get them into this war if we were just going to lose interest and walk away and leave them completely defeated and with no real strategy? Let me just read some of this to you. He says, "Nobody believes in our victory like I do. Nobody," Zelensky told Time in an interview after his trip. Instilling that belief in his allies, he said, takes all your power, your energy. You understand, it takes so much of everything. It's only getting harder. 20 months into the war, about a fifth of Ukraine's territory remains under Russian occupation. Tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians have been killed, and Zelensky can feel during his travels that global interest in the war has slackened. Yeah. So has the level of international support. Says, quote, "The scariest thing is that part of the world got used to the war in Ukraine," he says. "Exhaustion with the war rolls along like a wave. You see it in the United States, in Europe, and we see that as soon as they start to get a little tired, it becomes like a show to them. I can't watch this rerun for the 10th time." Public support for aid to Ukraine has been in decline for months in the U.S., and Zelensky's visit did nothing to revive it. Some 41% of Americans want Congress to provide more weapons to Kiev, down from 65% in June. So less than half of people want to provide more weapons to help Ukraine fight Russia. When Ukraine began a major counteroffensive, if you remember that, they were like, we're gearing up for that counteroffensive. We're going to strike back. We're going to gain back some more land. But it ended up not going very well. It ended up, they had very minimal gains, lots of losses. It was very slow. It was extremely underwhelming. And that's what this timepiece points out, that offensive has proceeded at an excruciating pace and with enormous losses, making it ever more difficult for Zelensky to convince partners that victory is around the corner. With the outbreak of war in Israel, even keeping the world's attention on Ukraine has become a major challenge. We have short attention spans in this country. You just watch the news cycle and tragedy strikes, all eyeballs are glued on that tragedy until the next one. And then we move on to the next one. So Ukraine is in no different of a position. They certainly had 100% of our attention for quite some time, but absolutely they don't now. Now all eyes are on Israel. So Kiev is feeling abandoned, ignored. They're feeling like the broken up with lover. After his visit to Washington, if you remember, he came to Washington this second time. The first time he spoke, got all those standing ovations. The second time, it was just kind of a trip, and it was almost, it was like, oh, Zelensky's here. And that was kind of it. Said Time followed the president and his team back to Kiev, hoping to understand how they would react to the signals they had received, especially the insistent calls for Zelensky to fight corruption inside his own government and the fading enthusiasm for a war with no end in sight. That's the thing. There's no end in sight to this war. Russia still is holding on to the territory it's taken, and they're not going to be battled back. They're not going to give it back. So the end, we all knew going into this that Russia was going to achieve a significant amount of what it set out to achieve. And that in the end, land would absolutely be lost to Russia, and so would many lives. And so many of us said, this is not worth the battle. Don't fight this. Negotiate. Go in there and look for peace. Try to come up with an agreement. You're already in a civil war with Donbass for the last decade nearly. Crimea's been gone for a near decade as well. Give them up. Give up that territory. It wasn't yours anyway. You weren't managing it. They didn't want you around. It's not like you got kicked out. They had already kicked you out. So let those areas be run by Russia. Let them have that in exchange for the peace. They didn't want to do that. People called us out saying that we were terrible human beings for even calling for peace. And instead now, this timepiece puts out there that over 100,000 Ukrainians have been killed. 100,000 Ukrainians killed. Now, put that into perspective with what's going on in Gaza. For example, they have 8,500 people killed, civilians. So it's terrible. 100,000, many of which were civilians. Horrific in Ukraine. But nobody was calling for peace, and still not. This goes on to say that on my first day in Kiev, this is Simon speaking, I asked one member of his circle how the president was feeling. And the response came without a second's hesitation: angry. They say that, he used to have a lot of sparkle and optimism, and the lighthearted kind of Zelensky with a sense of humor. But now they say that he walks in, he gets the updates, he gives the orders, he walks out, and that's it. That most of all, Zelensky feels betrayed by his Western allies, that they've left him without the means to win the war, only means to survive it. Well, no kidding. That was obviously happening from the beginning. Many of us knew, how are you ever going to fight this war and win this war? If we're not sending American troops in, which I'm absolutely not in favor of, but if you're not going to send troops in, there was no way Ukraine was going to win this war. There was no way. And most of us absolutely knew that. If you just looked at this logically rather than emotionally, you could see there was no way Ukraine was going to win this. So this endless giving them money, endless giving them weapons, none of it, they weren't going to be able to beat Russia back. You can't fight a superpower like Russia with that mighty of a military. It's nearly impossible. And so this is going to be, if they're going to have a win, which, okay, there is a possibility Ukraine could win. There's a possibility that they could gain all that land back, but it won't be anytime soon. We're talking decades. This would be a stalemate like North and South Korea, that it would have to be just a frozen war, a cold war. And then maybe at some point, there's a lot of like little acts of terrorism or militia rising up, and maybe there's infighting, and they kind of get into Donbass and they sway hearts and minds, and they're able to get militia groups to rise up and kind of fight from within. I mean, anything's possible. All of that's possible, but that would take a really long time, a really, really long time. So they say, despite the recent setbacks on the battlefield, he does not intend to give up fighting or to sue for any kind of peace. It says ultimately, victory over Russia has hardened him into a form that worries some of his advisors. It is immovable, verging on the messianic. He deludes himself, one of his closest aides tells me in frustration. We're out of options. We're not winning, but try telling him that. So even the Ukrainians know. His top aides are saying, we're not winning this war. You're deluding yourself if you think you're going to win. So at least the Ukrainians are, it's just Zelensky, and Zelensky's allied with the West, his big tour of going around and being paraded around and championed, kids dressing up as him for Halloween. So he's got this deluded idea that the West is going to stick with him, and they're not. The West is not. This is so sad. This is, to me, incredibly horrible and sad. We should have never, this is our fault. We should have never put Ukraine in this position. We should have been the bigger, wiser, and we should have known, and we should have said, you need to negotiate for peace. Russia's on your border. Your country isn't moving. Russia's not suddenly not going to be your neighbor. You're going to be neighbors forever. So you need to get along. And guess what? The West, we're not on your borders, really. We're not really neighbors. You're never going to be accepted into the West like Germany or France or the UK. It's just not realistic. You've been asking to be in NATO for all of these years. It's never happened. And meanwhile, we turn around, and with Finland and Sweden, we pretty much just bring them right on into NATO the first minute they say, I'm interested. Ukraine has been courting us for a decade, trying to get into NATO with no avail. I mean, this whole thing is devastating. It's devastating that we put these people on the wrong path, that we truly did, that this was totally our fault. And now Zelensky's stubborn. He doesn't want to lose. He had all of that happen. He's still caught up in that. Says Zelensky's stubbornness, some of his aides say, has hurt their team's efforts to come up with a new strategy, a new message. As they've debated the future of the war, one issue has remained taboo: the possibility of negotiating a peace deal with the Russians. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to do it. Judging by recent surveys, most Ukrainians would reject such a move, especially if it entailed the loss of any occupied territory. Yeah, so the Ukrainians don't even really want to give up either. They don't want to give up those territories. They don't want to lose the war. Nobody wants to lose. Losing is never fun. Zelensky remains dead set against even a temporary truce. For us, it would mean leaving this wound open for future generations, he said. Maybe it would calm some people down inside of our country and outside, at least those who want to wrap things up at a nice price. But for me, that's a problem because we are left with this explosive force. We only delay its detonation. He describes this as a war of wills. He says, "I've long lived with this fear. A third world war could start in Ukraine, continue in Israel, and move on there to Asia, and then explode somewhere else." That was his message in Washington. "Help Ukraine stop the war before it spreads and before it's too late." And he worries his audience has stopped paying attention. These are massively different wars. The war in Ukraine is against Russia. Israel and Russia are not going to go to war against one another. They're allies, they're friends, they're buddies. I mean, Israel's certainly, I think, more allied with the United States, but I think it's a fragile. I think Israel can kind of go with whoever they think is going to help them in that moment. I think that Israel looks out for itself. This is something Americans could kind of learn. It'd be kind of nice. But Israel looks out for itself. So Israel is going to go with whichever country is going to ally and help Israel the most. And if that's China, Israel will do it. If it's Russia, which they are friendly, many Israelis are actually, 15% of their population is native Russian speaking. Many more understand Russian. Many of them, the vast majority of the immigrants who'd come in for a long period of time actually had come in from the old USSR. So there's a strong bond there, a tie there. This piece goes on to say that when he came to Washington this last time around, that members of Congress basically said to him, that senators and members of Congress were like, "Look, you got corruption. You got a lot of corruption, and we got to deal with this corruption. So what are we going to do? What are we going to do about this?" And he said, "Yeah, I know it's a big problem. We're working on it. We're trying to get rid of this corruption." So he fired a lot of people inside of his the people that were helping him with the war and his government officials. He fired a lot of them. The top aides there, according to this piece, say that Zelensky himself is not corrupt, actually. I know there's a lot of suspicion there, but says that the people around him are saying, no, he doesn't do it. He actually doesn't dip into the pie, but a lot of people around him do. And they said that they fired a lot of them, but then it didn't matter because the next round comes in and everybody just knows that corruption is the name of the game and they all start siphoning money. And so it's a big beast and a big problem, and they have not been able to get it under control. So we're right now talking about giving $105 billion to Israel and Ukraine, most of that to Ukraine, and yet we have admittedly a money laundering problem in Ukraine. But we're still talking about it. That makes you wonder who else is involved in that money laundering. What's to benefit some of these lawmakers who are really dead set on continuing to give money to Ukraine? Angus King, an independent senator from Maine, recalled the Ukrainian leader telling the audience when he had the private meeting with some of these lawmakers, he says, "You're giving money, we're giving our lives." But that statement wasn't enough because 10 days later, Congress passed a bill to temporarily avert government shutdown with no assistance for Ukraine. Americans aren't caring about Ukrainian lives. That's just not something anybody's thinking about. Mitt Romney even said, yeah, this is a great investment. We're spending less and none of our guys are dying. 100,000 Ukrainians, but none of our guys. Saying that Zelensky has been trying to say he wants to have a new strategy, he wants to retake certain cities, that he's trying to rally up the troops, rally up their motivation, telling them we're going to take this, we're going to take that, we're going to strike here, we're going to strike there. And the people, his military is coming back saying, with what? That they don't have the men or the weapons. Where are the weapons? Where's the artillery? And even if we had all of that, where are the men? We don't have the men. So they said even if the West gave them a bunch of weapons, they don't have anybody to use them. So really, they don't have any recruitments. The recruits are down. They've now started dipping into older and older. So now they've got, at first it was like 20 and early 30s. Now they're going into people into their mid 40s. So they're really just running through. This whole thing is just very sad. We should have absolutely been calling for peace this entire time. Essentially, this whole thing, this whole story from Time just really showcases a defeated Zelensky. And he's out of options. Money isn't going to save him. More military isn't going to save him. More military weapons. He doesn't even have the people to use those weapons. Basically, the only option it looks like for Ukraine is we either go in, we actually put NATO troops in Ukraine and actually start fighting a hot war with Russia, or we somehow get Ukraine to a resolution on this. Who is going to do that? Who's going to get them? Certainly not this administration. Maybe if another person wins the election this next time around, because they're not the ones who pushed for the war, they might say, okay, it's time to come to a peace agreement, and they might start to discuss with Zelensky how we get to that point. That's the only thing we can really hope for. I don't think we're going to have boots on the ground in Ukraine. I don't see that happening. But I also don't see the Biden administration calling for some sort of peace agreement with Russia. Everybody would be a loser in Washington at this point, by everybody except for the few GOP lawmakers who are saying, why are we doing this? Let's not give any more money. Why don't, this isn't worth it. This isn't something we should be doing. Only those lawmakers are going to kind of stand out later on as they were the right ones, and everybody else could be ridiculed, or look at how much spending you did on this war and how much you supported this war, and the war got us nothing. It literally, the only thing it gets us is a loss. I mean, it's even worse than getting nothing. It costs us. As Anthony Blinken is sitting there in front of the Appropriations Committee saying, we have to win because otherwise, and he's right, we have to win, otherwise we show our enemies that we're weak. Yeah, well, should have thought about that before you even got into a war that you were not going to win. There was no way for this to win. So you just marched us right on in there, only to make us look weak and stupid, spending a bunch of money and costing a bunch, and heartless, letting a bunch of Ukrainians die on behalf of our own personal vendetta with Russia. But so it's a very sad situation. I just wanted to give you guys an update with what's going on with Ukraine, because Ukraine, I mean, basically, it's like Israel ended the war in Ukraine. Certainly the coverage on Israel, we've just completely forgotten about Ukraine. Zelensky's feeling that. Ukraine is feeling that. And now I don't know what their future holds, but I know it's not going to be good. They're just going to have to come to a peace agreement with Russia. And hopefully there can be, some way forward. A frozen conflict is not good. That's not going to be a good situation either. They really just need to go into a peace agreement. But we've been saying that now for a while, and no one has been listening. So, that's just the state of war, unfortunately, in this country. We haven't been able to win a war in a really long time, and it doesn't look like we're going to either with this one. That's for sure. It's not going to start now. So, all right, guys, I want to tell you about Cozy Earth. This is a really awesome sheet company. They make more than just sheets. They make all kinds of amazing bedding. They even make like comfy clothes. As you get into winter, you're going to be wanting to get all snuggly in your comfy clothes as you sit around sipping hot cocoa in front of, the Christmas lights or whatever it is that you decorate your house with, if you do that at all. Or just, you want to cozy up because it's cold. It's cold outside. You want to cozy up in front of a fire. Well, this company is awesome. They make really high quality stuff, and it really is better. It is, I'm not going to lie. It's expensive. I bought my husband a blanket and some pillowcases with my own money. I paid for it, and I used my discount code. I'm not stupid. But the bedding is just fantastic. And all you've got to do is just swap out what you're currently using, and you will use this great company, Cozy Earth. These are soft, they're breathable, they're temperature regulating, which is really important, but they're really soft, they're really cozy, and they're really great at temper regulation. So if you can try these out, they have this really awesome guarantee, 100 nights. So you can try them out for 100 nights. And if you do not like it, then you just send them back and no questions asked, and they'll even refund you the shipping. So so just try it out. If you don't like it, I know you're going to get there and you're going to be like, well, these are luxury. So these are expensive. And then you're like, whoa. Yeah, well, if you don't like it, if you think they're not worth it, I can't believe I spent my money on that, then you can get your money back. But I'm telling you, you won't be able to send them back. You just won't, because they're so comfortable. So go to CozyEarth.com. These are made from viscose from bamboo, but really high quality stuff. I researched this, looking into it, like, how is this different from other viscose from bamboo companies? And I did the cheap thing. I went online. I was like, well, I can order other ones. So I did it. I went online and I ordered different sheets that were cheaper, and I tried them out thinking, oh, it's going to be the same. It wasn't the same. It just wasn't the same. I'm not lying to you. So check these out. Go to CozyEarth.com. use the code Iverson and you will get 40% off. You'll want to use that for sure. Code Iverson, 40% off when you visit CozyEarth.com. Try them out for 100 nights. If you don't like them, if you don't sleep cooler, send them back for a full refund. Okay, guys? CozyEarth.com, 40% off when you use the code Iverson.